A man who spent his previous life being crushed under fluorescent lights and unpaid overtime opens his eyes in a forest so quiet it doesn't feel like this world has ever heard the word deadline. No commute, no manager breathing down his neck, just trees, cold air, and a strange lightness in his own body that he hasn't felt since he was a teenager. He doesn't know yet that this forest is one of the most dangerous places on the entire continent, or that within a matter of weeks he'll be sheltering a runaway elf, a terrified fugitive mage, a mischievous fairy, and eventually something that hasn't been seen alive in centuries. All he knows right now is that he's alone, hungry, and holding a tool that can turn into anything he can imagine. That tool is about to make him one of the strangest and quietly wealthiest men this world has ever produced. Not through conquest, not through power, but through the simple, stubborn desire to build a good house and eat a good meal. Before any of that, there was a subway platform in Tokyo, and a man named Saujiro, 35 years old, a salaryman who had traded his 20s and half his 30s for a company that never once said thank you. Every hobby he'd once had got quietly buried under 12-hour shifts. He told himself it was temporary. It wasn't. One evening, half asleep on his feet from exhaustion, he stepped into the street without registering the truck bearing down on him. The impact ended his life before his brain even finished processing the danger. What came after wasn't blackness. It was a voice, calm, warm, faintly amused, telling him that everything was fine and that his soul hadn't disappeared like most people's do when they die. The voice belonged to a goddess named Anna, and she explained that years earlier, as a child, Saujiro had stopped to pick up a fallen shrine statue of hers and set it back in its place, without asking for anything in return. That small, thoughtless kindness had tied his soul to her, and now, watching him die so young and so tired, she couldn't bring herself to simply let him fade. She offered him something rare, a second life, in a different world, built entirely around whatever he actually wanted this time. He thought about it for a long while. Not wealth, not power, not revenge on a boss who'd never even remember his name. What Saujiro wanted was simple: to live slowly, to camp, to explore, to cook good food, and actually taste it, somewhere far from crowds and deadlines. Anna seemed genuinely pleased by the request. She granted him a skill she called craft gear, a divine tool that could reshape itself into virtually any implement he pictured in his mind, and a paired ability to lock any object it touched perfectly still in space, fixed in place until he chose to release it. She told him her name, called herself the Mother Goddess, and admitted, almost sadly, that granting him this blessing was going to cost her the last of her power. Before he could ask what she meant, she'd already sent him on his way, wishing him a life filled with happiness. He woke up in a forest, and the first thing he noticed was how good his body felt. No soreness, no fatigue, just quiet strength humming under his skin. He summoned craft gear for the first time and watched a dagger materialize into his palm as easily as thought. It worked. Encouraged, he pushed further, imagining the same tool reshaping into an axe, and when he tested its strength against a nearby tree, the trunk didn't just crack, it was severed in a single stroke, and it began falling directly toward him. Only sheer panic and a shouted command activated his second power in time, freezing the falling tree solid in midair, a breath above his head. That was how he learned, the hard way, exactly how much force he was suddenly capable of wielding. From there, survival instincts kicked in. He built a crude shelter, carved himself a walking staff that doubled as a snake and pitfall detector, found a river within his first hour of searching, and, after being ambushed by a horned rabbit monster, used his fixing power to freeze the creature mid-attack and turn it into dinner. He grilled the meat over a fire he'd started with tools carved from scratch, and the first bite convinced him that whatever world this was, at least the food had potential. It was, without question, the best meal he'd had in years, possibly ever. A stray dog with a ribbon around its neck wandered into his camp not long after. Clearly someone's lost pet, clearly hungry. He fed it, and shortly after, its owner came crashing through the trees. An elf girl with a bow, mid-panic, who initially accused him of having eaten her missing dog before realizing her mistake. She introduced herself, once she calmed down, as Mischa, a high elf who had been living alone in this forest for over a decade. The two parted ways that first meeting, but fate wasn't finished with them yet. The very next day, following the dog's frantic barking, Saujiro stumbled into a fight already in progress. Mischa, cornered and half-dressed after being ambushed while bathing, desperately fending off a massive storm griffin with fire magic. He drew the bird's attention, transformed his tool into a hammer, and threw it without much of a plan. The hammer connected with such catastrophic force that the griffin was dead before he even had a chance to activate his fixing ability. Mischa, stunned, called him something close to a war god. He apologized instead for interrupting her bath and offered his jacket. That single act of decency, paired with an accidental show of overwhelming strength, was the beginning of an actual friendship. Mischa explained what he'd wandered into. This was the forest of the divine tree, land blessed by ancient elven ancestors, filled with monsters and trees harder than stone, and untouched by anyone for 1,000 years because no one could physically cut through it. She'd tried to prove that to him herself, stabbing a tree with everything she had and barely scratching the bark. Saujiro's dagger, by contrast, slid through the same tree like it was nothing. It was in that moment she realized what he actually was, a sacred one, someone directly blessed by a god, a rank of person treated with near-religious reverence in this world. She apologized for not recognizing him sooner. He, in turn, apologized for not knowing that title existed at all. What followed was less a grand alliance and more two lonely people quietly deciding to stop being lonely. Mischa brought him salt in exchange for meat. He cooked her actual broth, actual seasoned food, for the first time in longer than she could remember, and she nearly cried over how good it tasted. She helped him name the dog. He settled on Mac, quietly inspired by a very embarrassing incident involving her bath, and she began spending more and more time at his growing campsite instead of alone in the wilderness. When her own shelter turned out to have been ransacked by monsters, the two of them decided to build a proper base together. 2 small houses, side by side, with Saujiro doing the impossible heavy lifting, his divine tool made trivial, and Mischa handling monster wards and scouting. It was around this time the forest started sending him gifts he hadn't asked for. A silk-producing moth, clearly a rare spirit beast, landed uninvited on his roof and wove him a length of cloth as an offering, apparently hoping to be allowed to stay. He named her Musubi, after a weaving goddess back home, and she became an enthusiastic, if slightly territorial, member of the household, much to Mac's visible annoyance. Soon after, a mole-like digging spirit beast showed up as well, delighted by the idea of turning his compost and waste into rich soil for a garden. He named that one Yukutama, after a Japanese harvest god, and set him loose on a small farm plot once the land was cleared. Mischa explained, with a knowing smile, that these creatures were drawn to the divine energy radiating off him, and reminded him, pointedly, that she herself had technically been the very first rare being to find him. Between the animals and the ever-expanding homestead, Saujiro's priorities began revealing themselves in increasingly specific ways. He built furniture, he built proper cooking equipment, and at one point, mid-conversation, he abruptly abandoned everything to spend hours constructing a genuinely detailed outhouse, complete with a lid, soap leaf substitute, and cloth in place of paper. A project he treated with the seriousness of a man laying the cornerstone of civilization. Mischa, watching him work with an intensity he hadn't shown for anything else, could only be amazed at how quickly it came together, and even more amazed once she actually got to use it. Eventually, supply runs became necessary. Mischa mentioned a nearby human settlement, Brownwalls, where she'd been trading forest goods for 2 decades, long enough that the guards at the gate treated her like a local celebrity. Saujiro tagged along, mostly for the promise of salt and pepper. Inside, they met Dolero, the town's head merchant, who nearly had a heart attack, realizing the reclusive elf had finally brought a companion after 20 years of solitary visits. The trade went smoothly enough on the surface. Saujiro walked away with cooking utensils and seasonings, but the true value of what they'd handed over only became apparent after they left. The magic stones and a massive venom snake gallbladder Mischa had brought in were worth more than Dolero's entire warehouse combined, forcing him into an enormous, humiliating debt just to cover it fairly. Also lingering in town was a scruffy, sharp-eyed, dark-haired man calling himself a painter, who struck up a casual conversation with Saujiro about the forest, the trees, and how absurd it was that he could apparently just cut lumber there without dying. That painter turned out to be Cedric, the actual Viscount of Brownwalls, moving through his own town in disguise because he found ceremony boring and information more useful gathered quietly. He came away from their brief talk with a strong hunch that this new arrival was going to change quite a lot around here. A hunch reinforced days later when a member of the royal court personally requested that very same snake gallbladder to treat a poisoned prince, and later still, when word spread that the country's most feared battle mage had been spotted heading straight into the Divine Tree Forest. That mage found Saujiro's original, long-abandoned shelter before he did. When he finally returned to dismantle it, he was ambushed by an aggressive bear monster, and saved, unexpectedly, by shadowy tentacle-like hands that erupted from inside the shelter to hold the bear back. The caster turned out to be hiding inside his old tent, a terrified, disheveled girl in a Japanese school uniform who introduced herself, once she'd stopped screaming, as Ayano. She was, in fact, the very mage Cedric had warned him about, a supposedly terrifying A-rank battle mage who, up close, was really just a traumatized teenager who'd been surviving on instinct and dark magic for 4 years straight, unable to properly forage, unable to trust anyone, and clinging to the sturdiest shelter she'd found in the whole forest because it happened to be the one thing that had kept her alive. Her story poured out slowly. She too was Japanese, reincarnated after a fatal accident, dropped into this world with a cheat-tier magic ability and absolutely no support system. Every attempt she'd made to build friendships had collapsed, most painfully with a group of adventurers who'd pretended to protect her after a battle, only for her to realize, just in time, that they intended to hand her over as a scapegoat. She'd run before they could, and had been running, essentially, ever since, hunted by suspicion, drained by bureaucracy, and starved not just of food, but of a single kind word. Saujiro recognized something of his old, exhausted self in her exhaustion. He offered her a home on the spot, not out of pity, he made clear, but because her magic was genuinely valuable, and because nobody deserved to live like that. She broke down in relief and agreed to stay, and within days, he'd built her a proper cabin, complete with the same careful attention he'd given everything else. What began as a wary, twitchy houseguest slowly turned into an essential part of the household. Her shadow manipulation and weightlessness magic cut his construction and hauling time dramatically, and in return, she got something she hadn't had in years: actual meals, actual rest, and people who said good morning to her and meant it. Not every new arrival integrated so smoothly. A miniature, imperious fairy named Senya appeared next, having claimed a half-built shrine structure Saujiro had abandoned mid-project as her personal residence, and promptly declared herself his attendant in exchange for staying there. She was helpful in the way a hurricane is occasionally useful for clearing debris, offering genuinely valuable knowledge about the forest's resources, but also making outrageous demands, teasing everyone mercilessly, and, on first meeting Ayano, immediately attacking her under the assumption that any dark magic user must be evil. It took real effort from Saujiro to convince Senya that Ayano was harmless, and even more effort to convince Ayano that the tiny, terrifying fairy wasn't going to eat her. Under Senya's occasionally reluctant guidance, the homestead kept expanding at a pace that startled even the people building it. She taught him how to produce a transparent, glass-like film from tree cellulose and moth silk resin, strong enough to double as windows, letting him design a proper A-frame rest cabin with real natural light, something none of the crude early structures had. Mischa and Ayano pitched in on the labor, and the finished cabin drew genuine praise from both of them. Mischa noting how the whole build seemed to carry a kind of unity in it, born from several very different people working the wood together. Alongside the cabin came a working well and hand pump, built almost entirely from first principles: a cylinder, a piston, a valve made from tanned leather and shaped copper, driven into the ground with Ayano's shadow magic, making the excavation almost effortless. When it finally worked, water gushing out on the first proper pump, the small, unglamorous triumph of it meant more to the group than almost anything else they'd built, if only because it meant real independence from the unpredictable river. Through all of this, Senya let slip something that reframed the whole project in Saujiro's mind. Mischa's real goal in living out here for 20 years wasn't simple isolation. It was protection. She was trying to keep the Divine Tree Forest's monstrous resources out of the hands of any nation that might weaponize them, refusing all offers of help that came with strings attached. And because of that stubborn integrity, she'd been quietly ostracized by both humans and her own people for decades. Saujiro, hearing this, didn't hesitate before deciding he wanted to support that goal completely, not out of ambition, but simply because it aligned with the life he wanted to build here anyway. When Senya, testing him, asked if he ever wanted to use his overwhelming power to conquer kingdoms or rule as a god, his answer was immediate and unbothered. Mischa would be furious with him if he did, so no. That loyalty was rewarded, eventually, with rice, smuggled in by Senya from an undisclosed acquaintance's warehouse in a bag she insisted, unconvincingly, that she hadn't stolen. For Saujiro and Ayano, both starved of home cooking for years, it might as well have been treasure. A full banquet followed. Grilled meat, fried tempura, rice-based dishes neither Mischa nor Senya had ever tasted, and enough alcohol that half the group ended up asleep by the fire. It was during that same night, carrying a dozing Mischa back to her bed, that something quietly shifted between them. Neither of them saying anything out loud, both of them privately, awkwardly aware that something had changed. Not long after, the quiet domestic rhythm of the homestead was interrupted for the first time by something genuinely momentous. Mischa returned from a hunting trip, covered in blood that wasn't her own, having found something no one in this world had reportedly seen alive in centuries. An injured wyvern, a smaller cousin of the true dragons, tangled and bleeding on the forest floor. Unable to leave it to die, she'd wrestled it into submission and dragged it all the way home, calling for Saujiro's protection against the predators drawn in by the scent of blood. They gave the creature a place to recover, and Mischa, who had spent 20 years in this forest without once encountering a dragon, and 200 years of life before that without seeing one at all, became almost single-mindedly devoted to its recovery, vanishing for days at a time to hunt suitable food and gather healing materials, barely sleeping, barely speaking to anyone else. Saujiro watched her run herself ragged over it, with a mixture of worry and quiet understanding, and eventually asked, gently, if he could see it too. When she brought him in and reassured the wounded animal that he was safe, it let him rest a hand on its neck for the first time. And in that same moment, something about the way the creature looked back at him, and then up toward the ceiling of the cabin, made him wonder, almost absently, if the roof was simply too small for what was coming next. That's where this chapter of his strange, quiet, impossibly productive second life leaves off. A former corporate slave who wanted nothing more than good food and a peaceful campsite, now standing at the center of a found family of elves, otherworlders, spirit beasts, and, apparently, the first living dragon anyone in this world has seen in 1,000 years. He still doesn't have any grand ambitions. He still just wants to eat well and build things that last. But increasingly, the things he builds, and the people and creatures drawn to build them alongside him, are turning into something far bigger than the leisurely life he originally asked the goddess for. The cabin walls groaned first, a deep, structural complaint that no one in the household had ever heard wood make before. Then came the crack, sharp as a rifle shot, and Mischa was awake and moving before her eyes had even finished opening, bow already in hand out of 2 decades of instinct, even though there was no monster outside. The monster was inside. It was in the room with them, and it had just tried to stretch. The wyvern, still healing, still half the size it would eventually become, but already far too large for the space they'd built to hold it, had shifted in its sleep. One wing, unfurling on reflex, had caught the support beam above its makeshift bed and bowed it nearly in half. Dust rained down. Somewhere near the roofline, a joint that Saujiro had cut and fitted with his own 2 hands, one of the first true beams of this entire homestead, let out a groan like it was personally offended, and gave another half-inch. Mischa was across the room in 3 strides, hands out, murmuring low and fast to the creature, coaxing the wing back down before it could do more damage, or hurt itself in the process. The wyvern blinked awake, confused, injured leg still wrapped, clearly unaware it had done anything at all. It simply hadn't known it no longer fit in the space it had fallen asleep in. That was the moment it became undeniable. This wasn't a wounded animal recovering in a spare room anymore. This was something that grew by the day, something whose body was already rewriting the rules of every structure they'd ever built for it, and the walls holding it, Walls meant for people, for a modest homestead life, simply weren't going to hold much longer. Saujiro had been asleep in the next cabin over when the crack woke him, and by the time he reached the doorway, staff already in hand out of pure reflex, he found Mischa standing in the wreckage of a support beam, with her palms still pressed to the wyvern's side, not looking at him, not looking at anything except the animal in front of her. There were dark circles under her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. Her hands, when he looked closer, weren't quite steady. It wasn't the wing that worried him, it was her. He'd have gone back to that quiet moment days earlier, the one where he'd rested a hand on the wyvern's neck for the first time, felt it trust him without a fight, and looked up at a ceiling that was, even then, obviously too small. If he hadn't already known exactly where this was going. He'd felt it coming. He just hadn't expected the roof to start proving him right at 3 in the morning. He didn't say anything about the beam yet. He crossed the room instead, crouched beside Mischa, and put a hand gently on her shoulder, not pulling her away, just letting her know he was there. She startled slightly, like she'd forgotten anyone else existed in the room, and for one unguarded second, before she caught herself, he saw just how exhausted she actually was. "It's fine," she said, too quickly. "It just needs more space. I'll figure something out." "You've been saying that for 4 days," he said, not unkindly. "You haven't slept properly since it got here. It doesn't matter. It does to me." She didn't answer that. She just looked back at the wyvern, checking its leg, checking the wing, checking everything except herself, and Saujiro understood, watching her, that this was a fight he wasn't going to win, standing in a half-collapsed cabin at 3 in the morning. But it was a fight he intended to have, soon, because a woman who had spent 20 years protecting this forest single-handedly, refusing help from anyone who ever offered it with strings attached, had apparently decided somewhere along the way that help wasn't something she was allowed to want, even from people who didn't have strings attached at all. That would come later. Right now, there was a more immediate problem, and it was staring at both of them with wide, unbothered eyes, utterly unaware that it had just condemned an entire building to demolition. By sunrise, the household had gathered outside the cracked cabin to survey the damage properly, and the verdict, once Saujiro walked the frame end to end, running a hand along the strained joints, was unanimous before anyone even said it out loud. This structure was done, not damaged, done. It had never been built to hold something with a wingspan that would, within a season or two, likely eclipse the roofline of the house itself, and pretending otherwise, patching cracks and reinforcing beams one emergency at a time, was only going to end with the whole thing coming down around the creature it was supposed to be protecting. "We build something new," Saujiro said, mostly to himself, already turning the shape of the problem over in his mind. "Bigger, reinforced, something that can actually hold it as it grows, not just as it is right now." Ayano, arms wrapped around herself against the morning chill, glanced between the wyvern and the ruined support beam with the particular unease of someone doing math she didn't like the answer to. "How much bigger are we talking?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "Depends how big it gets." "Wyverns," Senya said, appearing out of nowhere the way she always did, perched cross-legged on a fence post, with the easy authority of someone who'd apparently read every book on the subject and remembered all of it. "Get very, very large. Thank you for asking. Cousin species to true dragons. Juveniles look small and harmless right up until the week they don't. You're looking at something that could eventually rival a small house on its own, without factoring in the wingspan." Saujiro absorbed that with the same flat calm he absorbed most impossible information in this world, which was to say he nodded once, filed it away as a design constraint, and started thinking about load-bearing angles. Mischa, arms crossed, jaw tight, said nothing. She was looking at the wyvern the way a mother might look at a child who'd just outgrown its crib overnight, proud and terrified, and clearly exhausted past the point of admitting it. "I can source stronger timber from deeper in the forest," she said finally, voice a little too clipped. "The old-growth trunks near the eastern ridge, the ones even the monsters avoid. I'll head out today." "You will not," Saujiro said, mild as ever, but with a weight underneath it she wasn't used to hearing from him. "You've barely slept in 4 days. I'm fine. You froze mid-sentence yesterday. Standing up, you didn't even notice." Her mouth opened, then closed. Mac, curled at her feet, let out a low, unimpressed whine, as if even the dog had an opinion on the matter. Someone has to look after it, she said, quieter now. And there it was, the actual truth underneath the exhaustion, laid bare for a second, before she could bury it again. It doesn't trust anyone else yet, if I'm not here. You have people here, Saujiro said. That's the whole point of the people. You don't have to do this alone. You never did. Not the wyvern, not the forest, not any of it. You've just never let anyone actually help you carry something before, and I think you forgot you're allowed to. The clearing went quiet. Even Senya, who filled silences reflexively the way other people breathed, didn't say anything. Mischa looked at him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes. Pride and stubbornness. And underneath both of those, something rawer that looked almost like relief at being caught. It's not that simple, she said eventually, but there was no real fight left in it. It can be, he said. Let Ayano's magic pull the timber. Let me build the frame. You stay here, rest, and keep the wyvern calm while we work. That's not doing nothing. That's the part only you can actually do. It took her another full minute to nod, and when she did, it looked like it cost her something. 20 years of solitary self-reliance, quietly cracking, just slightly, the same way the beam above the wyvern's bed had cracked the night before. Not breaking, just admitting, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that it didn't have to hold everything alone. Fine, she said, and the word came out almost embarrassed. Fine, but I'm still choosing the timber. I know which trees will actually hold. Deal, Saujiro said, and if he felt any satisfaction at winning that particular argument, he had the decency not to show it on his face. The build that followed was, without question, the most ambitious thing Saujiro had attempted since arriving in this world. Bigger than the A-frame cabin, bigger than the well, bigger even than the modest dream of a good house he'd originally set out to build back when his only concern had been keeping rain off his head. This wasn't a house anymore. This was closer to a hangar, a reinforced lodge with a vaulted roof, high enough to let a growing wyvern stretch both wings without ever touching a beam again, walls thick enough to muffle the sound of a body that size shifting in its sleep, and a floor reinforced from underneath so it wouldn't buckle under weight that hadn't finished accumulating yet. Mischa returned from the eastern ridge with timber, unlike anything Saujiro had cut before, trunks so dense and dark they barely floated in the river when they tried to transport them, wood that Craft Gear's blade, even shaped into its sharpest configuration, took real effort to bite into for the first time since he'd arrived. Elderwood, she explained, running a hand almost reverently along the bark. It doesn't grow near people. It grows where nothing dares disturb it. If anything in this forest can hold a wyvern's full weight without complaint, it's this. Ayano's role turned out to be the one that made the impossible timeline possible at all. Her shadow magic, the same weightless, boundary-blurring ability that had once let her survive alone in the forest for 4 brutal years, let her lift entire trunks as though they weighed nothing, sliding them into position, with a precision no ordinary construction crew could have matched even with proper equipment. What might have taken weeks of hauling and cutting with normal methods took days instead, and more than once, Saujiro caught himself just watching her work. Steady, focused, utterly unlike the twitchy, cornered girl he'd found hiding in his old shelter not so long ago. She'd found her footing here. It showed in every controlled, confident motion. You're better at this than you give yourself credit for, he told her, during a rare pause, both of them catching their breath in the shade of a half-raised wall. She glanced at him sideways, faint color rising in her cheeks. It's just moving wood. It's not, and you know it. He nodded toward the frame taking shape behind them, walls that wouldn't exist without her, angles that would have taken him twice as long alone. This doesn't happen without you. None of it does. She didn't have a response for that. She just ducked her head, half smiling, and went back to work. And Saujiro thought, not for the first time, that this strange, cobbled-together family of his had a way of quietly saving each other in ways none of them ever fully admitted out loud. Senya, for her part, contributed exactly what Senya always contributed: outrageous, occasionally invaluable knowledge, delivered with maximum smugness and minimum humility. It was her insistence, over Saujiro's initial skepticism, that the lodge needed a ventilated upper section, some kind of gap near the roofline that could vent heat and let the wyvern regulate its own body temperature as it grew, since apparently wyverns ran hotter than any mammal and would cook themselves alive in a sealed structure during the warmer months. You would have built your dragon an oven, she informed him, hovering upside down in front of his face while he worked, arms crossed with the particular satisfaction of someone who loved being right. A very nice oven, with a dragon inside it. Duly noted, he said, already adjusting the framing to accommodate a proper vent, because as irritating as she was very rarely actually wrong about the forest's stranger residents. Mischa, true to her word, stayed behind at the wyvern's side through most of the build, but stayed differently than she had before. She slept when Saujiro told her to sleep, in the same blunt, no-nonsense tone she used on everyone else, and rarely had turned back on herself. She let Ayano's shadows carry water and feed to the wyvern when her own arms were too tired to manage it. She let Mac curl up against the creature's side during the daylight hours, so she could actually close her eyes for more than 20 minutes at a stretch. It wasn't easy for her. Saujiro caught her more than once standing in the doorway, clearly fighting the urge to go do everything herself. But bit by bit, day by day, she let the found family around her hold up a weight she'd spent 20 solitary years, convinced only she was capable of carrying. By the fourth day, the wyvern itself seemed to understand something had changed too. It grew calmer around the others in a way it hadn't before, no longer flinching quite as hard when Ayano's shadows moved nearby, allowing Senya to perch on its horns without complaint, even accepting food directly from Saujiro's hand without waiting for Mischa's presence to confirm it was safe. Trust, it turned out, spread the same way exhaustion had, quietly, and faster than anyone expected, once the first crack in the wall let it through. The lodge itself rose from the clearing like something out of a story no one in this world would believe, a structure with proportions that made no sense for a homestead this size. Timber joints locked flawlessly into place through craft gear's steady, patient fixing, walls thick enough to muffle a heartbeat, a roof high enough to swallow the sky. When Saujiro finally lowered the last beam into position, locking it solid with a quiet press of his ability, and stepped back to look at the whole thing standing complete in the afternoon light, even he had to admit, it barely looked like something a single man with a magic tool should have been able to build in under a week. It looked, if he was being honest with himself, like the first structure he'd ever built that genuinely shouldn't have been possible. Mischa stood beside him at the tree line, watching the wyvern take its first tentative steps into the new lodge, testing the space, stretching both wings fully for what looked like the first time since it had been rescued, without a single beam so much as creaking under the motion. Something in her posture eased that Saujiro hadn't seen ease in days. Weeks, maybe. Longer than that, if he thought about it honestly. It fits, she said quietly, almost like she hadn't quite believed it would until she saw it with her own eyes. It fits, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment, watching the creature circle the space, clearly delighted in a way that translated easily, even without words. Then, without looking at him, she said, "Thank you for making me stay. I don't think I would have, if you hadn't pushed." "I know," he said simply. "That's why I pushed." She huffed out something that was almost a laugh, tired but real, and for the first time in days, the exhaustion in her face looked less like something dragging her under, and more like something she'd finally allowed herself to actually feel, now that there were other hands nearby to catch her if it did. That should have been the end of it, the quiet, hard-won victory of a family building something impossible together, and coming out the other side closer than they'd started. And for one evening, sitting around the fire outside the new lodge, sharing a meal while the wyvern dozed contentedly in a space finally built to hold it, it felt exactly like that. Mac stretched out by the flames. Musubi wove idle threads of silk into the firelight for no reason except that she liked to. Yukutama surfaced briefly from his garden tunnels to steal a piece of meat before vanishing again. It was, in every way that mattered, exactly the kind of peaceful, food-filled evening Saujiro had once asked a goddess for, back when all of this had still just been a wish, spoken into a quiet, warm dark. It was Senya who broke the moment, and she did it the way she broke most moments, abruptly, and with absolutely no sense of timing. "You do know," she said, licking sauce off her fingers with theatrical unconcern, "that something this size doesn't exactly build itself quietly. You've had elven timber crews hauling elderwood through the forest for 4 straight days. You've had a structure the size of a small manor go up practically overnight. And you've had a very large, very rare flying reptile testing its wings in broad daylight, not half a mile from a trade road that merchants use twice a week. The fire crackled. Mischa's expression shifted from contentment to something sharper, faster than Saujiro had ever seen it move. No one's seen it, Ayano said, though there was already doubt creeping into her voice as she said it. No one's seen it yet, Senya corrected, entirely too casually for the weight of what she was saying. But sound carries, and smoke carries. And elves who trade lumber in bulk without explanation tend to get noticed, especially by a certain Viscount who already thinks something strange is happening out here. She popped another piece of meat into her mouth, utterly unbothered by the silence she'd just detonated across the campfire. I'm only saying, enjoy tonight. Because I don't think this stays quiet much longer. Saujiro looked toward the new lodge, toward the massive, sleeping shape curled inside it. Wings finally, safely at rest under a roof built specifically to hold them. A week ago, his biggest problem had been a cracked beam and a woman too stubborn to ask for help. Tonight, both of those problems were solved. But somewhere beyond the tree line, past brown walls, past the borders of a forest that had kept its secrets for 1,000 years, word was already beginning to move. A whisper here, a merchant's offhand comment there, the kind of rumor that started small and grew the way everything in this forest seemed to grow lately, quietly, and far faster than anyone was ready for. And for the first time since waking up alone in these trees, with nothing but a tool that could become anything, Saujiro understood, with a certainty that settled cold in his chest, despite the warmth of the fire, that the peaceful life he'd built here was no longer just his to protect.